I recently graduated from CDL school and began looking for a job in my field. After applying to every large vehicle driving position I could find, I received a response about an hour later for a bus driver role at Frederickson High School. The message read, "Hello, George. We've reviewed your application and believe you're a great fit for our position. Your first day will start tomorrow. Your bus is number 458 and is located at a bus yard on 207 Riverside Street. You may arrive at the yard at any time, but please make sure to reach the school before 4 a.m., which is when the students will be dismissed. After they board, you'll take them to their 5 stops on Old Military Road. Ernest Frederickson Principal, Frederickson High School." I found it odd that there was no interview, but I didn't want to overthink what seemed like a great opportunity. It also seemed unusual that the school ran so late, but I assumed it operated 24/7, possibly with multiple shifts to follow social distancing guidelines or just for overall efficiency. Around 3:15 a.m., I hopped into my old 1974 Ford F-250 and made the short 15-minute drive to the address provided. The bus yard was at a gated lot near a small guard shack. The lot itself was a flat dirt area with several buses parked at the back and an open space at the front to maneuver them. The yard was fenced in, except where the gate and shack were located. When I arrived, the guard seemed startled and cautiously cracked open the window. "Wow, who are you?" he stammered. Hello? I'm George Redwood. I'm here for bus 458. Are you all right? I replied. He glanced at a paper for a moment before handing me a key, which I assumed was for my bus. All right, sir. Here's your key. Find your bus and swap its spot with your truck, then you're good to go. The gate opened and I did as instructed. I located bus 458, drove it to the front of the yard, and parked it in a corner. I then returned to my truck, parked it where the bus had been, and brought the bus back to the gate. It was one of those flat front designs where the engine is at the rear and the driver sits in front of the front wheels, though I'm unsure what that model is officially called. The bus had its fair share of dents and scratches, mainly on the front bumper, but I didn't dwell on it and began my shift. I reached the school at 3:47 a.m., noticing mine was the only bus. It was a small school, so that wasn't too surprising. While waiting for the students to be dismissed, I found a list of rules along with a map wedged between the steering wheel and the windshield. Rules for Frederickson High School Bising. You must follow these rules when driving on Old Military Road. We cannot guarantee your safety if you break them. 1. Do not use any electronic devices for navigation. They will mislead you. We've provided a printed map for you to follow. 2. Bus stops are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Each stop has a bench enclosed by 3 walls and a roof, with the opening at the front. The number will be visible on both sides of all 3 walls. If a stop doesn't match this description, leave immediately and avoid looking around too much. 3. The road should be old, winding, and poorly maintained. If it suddenly becomes straight and newly paved, with scenery that repeats, slam on the brakes and turn around. Continue only when the road curves again and the straight section is out of sight. If you can't turn around, reverse until the road returns to normal. 4. If the road ends suddenly, reverse or turn around until the dead end is no longer visible. 5. If the road merges with another, remember which side you came from in case you need to backtrack. Don't drive on any road you didn't originally travel. 6. If you encounter other vehicles, disable them. Minor damage to the bus is fine. You can plow through smaller cars or trucks, but larger vehicles might pose more of a challenge. Do not drop off students if your bus is being pursued or if you've recently disabled a vehicle near a stop. 7. If your bus becomes stuck, inform the students. They'll know what to do. A handgun is stored in the glove compartment. Use it if necessary. Remain in the bus until dawn, then contact us for assistance. You won't lose any pay if this occurs. 8. If you hear a church bell, avoid its source. If it's behind you, continue as normal. If it's in front or beside you, turn around and drive until the ringing stops. 9. If you spot a creature running alongside your bus on the right, don't open any doors or windows. You can confuse it by alternating between speeding up and slowing down. This might give you an opportunity to run it over, which is the only way to stop it. 10. If the engine stalls for no apparent reason, restart it immediately and floor it. Don't look behind you. If restarting fails, follow Rule 7. 11. If you see a human figure on the road, run it over, even if it resembles someone you know. It's not human. If you fail to hit it, skip any remaining stops and head back to the yard as quickly as possible. Do not open any doors or windows. Though it may disappear, it's still following you. Once back at the yard, alert the guard. 12. If a mansion appears in the distance, turn off all lights and accelerate. None of the students live there. The mansion often changes position, but it's twice as tall as the forest, and its rooms emit light. Spot it early enough to shut off your headlights before the owners notice. If a blinding light appears behind you, put on the modified sunglasses in the glove compartment and drive fast. The students have similar glasses, so don't worry about them. If you need to turn around, do so quickly. Avoid dropping off students until the owners stop pursuing you and the light disappears. 13. The true end of the road merges with a larger one at a three-way stop. If students remain on board after you've passed all 5 stops, return to the beginning and try again. Repeat as necessary, or head back to the yard if you're too tired. I was at a loss for how to process all of this. Sure, it sounded utterly impossible, but as someone who's spent plenty of time lurking on this subreddit, I knew better than to dismiss these rules outright. I decided I'd follow them, but with a plan. Unless they could cause harm to someone if they were fake, like ramming into another vehicle, I'd obey. If I could prove any of them were real without violating the rest, I'd assume they were all genuine and follow them without question. At exactly 4 a.m., the students exited the school and boarded the bus. I counted about 20 of them, which was roughly 80% capacity under social distancing rules. Strangely, none of the students seemed disturbed by the situation. They acted like this was a normal day for them, as if they'd been attending this school for so long that nothing fazed them anymore. Once everyone was on board, I shut the doors and got on the road. It was a narrow 2-lane route through a dense forest, clearly neglected for years. The pavement was cracked, and the potholes were poorly patched, resembling the amateur road repairs you'd see in old movies. This was pretty typical for upstate New York, so I didn't think much of it. For the first 10 minutes, nothing out of the ordinary happened, and I managed to drop off 3 students at the first stop without any trouble. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a student scream, "They're here!" I glanced at the left mirror, and sure enough, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, fast approaching. Rule 6. If any other vehicles appear on the road, disable them by any means possible. I pressed down on the gas, but whatever was behind us was gaining speed. In seconds, the vehicle was tailgating me so closely that I couldn't even see its headlights in the rear window anymore. I just knew it was right there. "What's going on?" I yelled to the students, hoping, though deep down I knew better, that this was some kind of prank. Several students shouted back at once, but their voices blended together, making it impossible to understand them. "So," I asked, "should I brake check this thing?" Immediately, all of them yelled, "Yes!" in unison. Without hesitation, I slammed the brakes. The bus screeched to a halt, and moments later, I heard the unmistakable sound of metal crunching against metal. I quickly accelerated again and caught a glimpse in the rear window. The car had stopped following. At the speed we were going, the collision must have wrecked its engine. Problem solved for now. A minute later, I reached the second stop. 2 students, a boy and a girl, stood up, ready to get off. But as I was about to open the door, I realized something horrifying. This wasn't stop 2, it was stop Z. Rule 2. The bus stops you can drop kids off at are labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If you stop at a bus stop that is not one of the above, leave immediately. Panic shot through me. I slammed the doors shut and floored the gas, sending the bus speeding away. The 2 students who had been at the front barely held onto the railing as they scrambled to stay upright. Not even a second after the doors closed, I heard a horrifying screech from the right side of the bus. "Driver! Look!" one of the students shouted, pointing at the doors. I stole a quick glance and my blood ran cold. Something was wedged between the door, an arm, but not human. It resembled the limb of a massive gingerbread man, though it absorbed light instead of reflecting it. I could hear the thing it belonged to being dragged alongside the bus, the sound a disturbing blend of wood scraping against metal. I opened the doors briefly to dislodge it, and whatever it was tumbled away, leaving us in tense silence. "What was that?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The girl still gripping the railing replied, "I'm not sure. I've seen it before, but it doesn't always get this close. The fake bus stop doesn't show up often, maybe once a month. Usually the creatures can't catch up." The boy quietly returned to his seat, and I took a deep breath. That was when a new thought hit me, and I asked the girl, "How long have you been dealing with this?" "I've lived here all my life. Every house in this area has its own weird rules. It's just how things are, but it's all my family can afford, so we've stayed." Before I could ask anything else, she added, "Oh, and by the way, my name's Angela." "I'm George," I replied. "Mine's sticking around up here so we can—" "This is the police. Stop your vehicle immediately." A harsh voice blared through a megaphone, but something about it wasn't right. It was a poor imitation of a human voice, like someone fed a sentence through a glitchy text-to-speech program. I snapped my attention to the left lane, where a police cruiser had appeared, matching my speed. I hadn't noticed it at all. I'd been so caught up in talking to Angela that I didn't realize what was happening. The students must have been too distracted to warn me like before. I slowed down, and the cruiser moved ahead, positioning itself to perform a pit maneuver. But when I glanced inside the car, my heart nearly stopped. The creatures inside were vaguely humanoid, just enough to operate a vehicle designed for humans. Their bodies were like something out of a nightmare, resembling venom, but covered in dark, bluish-black scales, like reptilian skin. The one in the passenger seat turned its head an unnatural 90 degrees to stare at me without moving its body. Its eyes were vertical, thin lines, stretching from its mouth all the way to the top of its head, glowing a pale white, eerily similar to the eyes of Herobrine from Minecraft. For what felt like an eternity, we locked eyes. In that moment, I lost all sense of myself. I wasn't driving a bus. I wasn't even a person anymore. Everything around me faded into nothingness. There was only the light emanating from the creature's eyes. After what felt like an eternity, I snapped out of the trance when the cruiser became wedged between the cliff and my bus. The impact jolted me back to reality, and I suddenly realized what had happened. The road had curved, but I hadn't noticed. The bus had been drifting into the left lane, pressing the cruiser against the rock face. The collision brought it to a near-instant stop. I swerved back into my lane, shaken but trying to regain control. Angela was inches from my face, screaming, "You're finally back!" before collapsing to the floor in tears, repeating the phrase between sobs. "How long was I staring at that thing?" I asked, still dazed. Her sobs only grew louder in response. "Oh, okay," I said awkwardly. There's a tissue box between the dashboard and the windshield. Maybe you should take off your mask until you're done crying." I wanted to console her, but had no idea how to handle the situation. So, I just let her cry while leaning against my right leg, figuring it was better than nothing. It was what usually helped me during a breakdown, though I wasn't sure how well it worked for others, or if Angela was even neurotypical in the first place. Less than a minute after the crash, we reached stop 3. 2 students got up to exit, and Angela quickly moved out of their way as they stepped off the bus and headed down a dark, ominous path. As we pulled away from the stop, Angela finally spoke again, answering my earlier question. "You were staring at that thing for, 5 minutes," she said, her voice still shaky. "You were so stiff that I couldn't do anything. I couldn't reach the brakes, barely move the wheel. At least your foot wasn't on the diesel?" I chuckled. "I just call it the accelerator. But what's weirder, calling a liquid fuel gas or calling the accelerator the gas?" She laughed faintly, but then quickly added, "We should really pay attention now. Let's not get caught off guard like that again." "Good idea." Angela stood up, brushing herself off. "I'm heading back to my seat so I don't get launched through the windshield. But if you need me, just call." "Got it," I replied. A few minutes passed, and then I heard strange clunking noises coming from the rear of the bus. Before any of us could react, the engine abruptly shut off. Rule 10. If the engine stops for seemingly no reason, immediately start it up again and floor it. "Do not look at what is behind the bus." Panic set in. I desperately twisted the key, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The bus kept gliding down the road from inertia, but I had barely any control. The power steering had gone out. Luckily, the road was still straight, but any sudden curves would force me to stop and resort to Rule 7. Then I noticed the headlights appear behind us again. The vehicle swerved into the left lane and rapidly closed the distance. It was the cruiser. Those things had shut off their lights and had been tailing us, using my taillights to navigate. I quickly averted my gaze to avoid being hypnotized again. I cranked the key for what felt like an eternity, and finally, the engine roared back to life. I floored the gas, causing the bus to lurch forward. The cruiser sped up as well, trying to keep pace. With the power steering restored, I jerked the wheel to the left, deliberately smashing the side of the bus into the cruiser. The impact crunched metal and sent the cruiser careening into the side of the road. I glanced into the left mirror and saw that the cruiser was wrecked. The frame was completely bent, and the creatures inside tried to lock eyes with me again through the rear view, but they were too far away to pull me into their hypnotic trance this time. Just ahead, Stop 4 came into view, but I sped past it. The cruiser had crashed too close to it, and there was no way I was stopping while those things were nearby. The area on the right had flattened out a bit, enough to fit some houses. They were large, at least 2,500 square feet each, and probably had basements as well, though I couldn't see them from the road. Stops 1 and 3 didn't have any visible houses, so this was the first time I'd seen any homes on the route. I decided to take the opportunity to ask the students about them. "Can someone from Stop 4 come up here for a sec? I've got a question about the houses." A boy from the seat directly behind me stood up and walked to the front. "How much does it actually cost to live here?" Before I could finish, I saw an old man with a cane crossing the road ahead of us. Rule 11. If you see a human on the road, run it over, even if it resembles a loved one. It's not a human. I didn't hesitate. I hit the accelerator, and the bus plowed through him. The screeching noise that followed confirmed it was no human, though I already knew that. After a brief, awkward silence, the boy answered my original question. "It's $50 a month, at least for me. And yeah, we've got rules just as messed up as the ones you're dealing with here." "Wow," I said, stunned. "That sounds like a bargain, but I guess it's not worth the mental and physical trauma that comes with it." "Exactly," he replied. "Anyone who lives here is either dirt poor or didn't know what they were getting into. The rent might be low, but we pay the real cost in other ways." I nodded. "I doubt you could report any of this to the authorities." "My family actually had to call 911 once. We told them some guy with a gun was in our house. No one believed the officers when they showed up and made Fred, that's the creature that stalks us at Stop 4, retreat into the forest. I could tell you more stories sometime." "Maybe," I said thoughtfully. The boy was about to head back to his seat. "Name's Tommy, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Tommy. I'd love to hear more about your life here sometime." As Tommy turned to leave, his face suddenly froze with fear. "Oh shit! Rule 9. Rule 9. If you see a creature on your right running parallel to your bus, do not under any circumstances open any doors or windows. You can confuse it by constantly accelerating and decelerating. This may allow you to run it over. That's the only way to stop it." I turned my head and saw the creature running alongside the bus. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, like a brute version of the creatures in the cruiser, with nearly identical arms and legs. It galloped like a horse on all fours, keeping pace with the bus, even as I hit 40 miles per hour. I sped up, but it matched my acceleration with ease. Tommy, realizing what was happening, bolted back to his seat, and the bus began to shake violently as I pushed it past safe speeds for the winding road. Now tearing down the road at over 80 miles per hour, the creature stayed beside the door, relentless in its pursuit. I finally slammed on the brakes, and the creature wasn't able to slow down as quickly. Seizing the moment, I swerved the bus into its path, running it over. The body thudded under the wheels, but before I could feel any relief, I noticed a pair of taillights ahead. The taillights flared as the vehicle slowed, and it wasn't some small car this time. It was a semi-truck. The truck gradually slowed to 20 miles per hour, forcing me to do the same. Something wasn't right, and I could sense the driver was planning something. Then I saw it. A blinding light reflected off my left mirror, darting around as the driver tried to hypnotize me again. But with a massive trailer attached, it couldn't maneuver as precisely, and after a few moments of trying, it gave up. As we trailed behind the truck, the students and I brainstormed ideas on how to deal with it. We tossed around thoughts on how we could use the size and slow speed of the semi against it. That's when I noticed something unusual to my right. The mansion. It loomed over the trees, towering at least 2 stories higher than the forest itself. It stretched wide across the landscape, reminiscent of the woodland mansions from Minecraft. Surrounded by dense foliage with a foreboding presence, an idea sparked. "Hey guys, do you think the mansion owners are allied with the truck driver?" Angela quickly replied, "I don't think so. I've never seen them work together. In fact, they seem hostile toward each other sometimes, but nowhere near as aggressive as they are with us." "Perfect," I said, formulating my plan. "You're gonna make the mansion owners attack the truck, aren't you?" Tommy guessed. "Exactly," I confirmed. "Just make sure you keep your distance so they don't come after us too," Tommy added. "Right," I nodded. I turned off the bus's lights as we neared the mansion, staying about 500 feet, 150 meters behind the truck. I saw the truck driver glance back at us through the mirror, his headlights momentarily lighting up the cab, as if to say, "I know you're still there." We inched closer to the mansion, and I allowed the bus to slow further, putting more distance between us and the truck without using the brakes to avoid alerting the driver. Eventually, we were about 200 feet, 60 meters away, crawling along at 2 miles per hour, 3 kilometers per hour. I engaged the parking brake, bringing the bus to a silent stop. The truck, unaware of our maneuver, continued forward at a snail's pace, seemingly stalling for time until reinforcements could arrive. We all donned our sunglasses, bracing ourselves for what was about to happen. As soon as the truck's headlights illuminated the road in front of the mansion, it triggered the attack. For a split second, I saw a flash of the mansion's light before my vision was filled with spots, like I'd stared into the sun for too long. Even through the sunglasses, it was painful to look at. The light engulfed the truck like a swarm of disturbed hornets. I wasted no time. I threw the bus into reverse and floored it, the engine roaring as we sped backward. The truck driver noticed the noise and tried to turn around, but with the massive trailer, it couldn't maneuver quickly enough. The driver had no choice but to flee forward, trying to escape the mansion owners. With the truck out of the way, I switched back into drive and continued down the road, maintaining a slower speed to avoid catching up with the semi. As we passed the now empty mansion, I slowed even further to take in the eerie sight. The front of the mansion was constructed from wooden walls resting on a concrete base. There was a massive hole in the facade, revealing rows of equally sized rooms, each with a window and illuminated by chandeliers. The contents of the rooms were as varied as they were bizarre. One was a kitchen, another a bedroom, but others were far stranger. One room was almost entirely filled with a tangled mass of wires. Another looked like a prison cell. One contained dozens of black cats, and yet another had a floor covered in spikes with doll heads mounted on them, a disturbingly creative touch. The room full of cats caught my attention. I brought the bus to a stop. "Why is there a room full of cats?" I asked aloud. "A room full of what? They have cats in there?" Tommy replied, clearly surprised. "I don't think we've ever been able to get a good look at the mansion before," another student chimed in. "This might be the first time someone's distracted the owners long enough." I stood up from my seat, an idea forming. "I want to check out the cat room," I announced to the students. "Just go to the window, don't enter the mansion. Seriously, don't," warned the same student from earlier. "And park the bus right next to the window," Angela added. "Wait, what's your name?" I asked the student who had given the advice. "Oh, I'm Joseph." "All right, good to know." I parked the bus as close as possible to the mansion window, right next to the cat room. I stepped outside and peered into the window, grimacing at the sight inside. Cats were everywhere, all malnourished and trudging through their own filth. In the center of the room was a literal island made of feces. This was beyond disturbing. I grabbed a rock and smashed the window repeatedly until the glass finally gave way, cracking in half. I could have used the gun, but I didn't want to waste ammo or draw any unwanted attention. Tommy, Angela, and 2 other students joined me to help. We kept bashing at the broken window until we made a hole big enough for the cats to escape. Once we pointed the way out, the cats bolted through the opening, rushing into the forest. Whatever awaited them in the wild was a far better fate than whatever horrors the mansion owners had in store. Curious about the room filled with wires, I walked over to investigate, noting that the prison cell was the only thing separating the 2 rooms. I could probably make a few $1,000 with all this copper, I remarked. Will we get any of it? Tommy asked. Sure. I'll give you guys a cut for helping out, but I'm keeping the majority as compensation for putting up with all this. $20 an hour doesn't cut it. I called the rest of the students to help with the heist, promising them a small share of the profits. I smashed the window of the wire room with the same rock, creating a hole just big enough for my fist. You know, this would be easier if someone just went inside the mansion and... No! The students yelled in unison, cutting me off. Okay, forget I said anything, I muttered. We kept smashing at the window until the hole was large enough to climb through. Once inside, we quickly loaded all the copper wires into the bus. We worked fast, knowing the mansion owners could return at any moment, though we had already scoped out a hiding spot just in case. Luckily, they didn't return, and we managed to organize the wires while driving away. As I neared stop 5, I spotted the owners returning from their previous mission. My heart raced, but I quickly put on my sunglasses and floored the bus, driving blindly through the bright light. Fortunately, they weren't interested in us this time and continued on their way, seemingly unaware of what we had done. It appeared they only attacked those who disturbed them directly, like driving near the mansion. They still had no clue that we had freed their cats and stolen their wires, and even if they found out, they wouldn't know who was responsible. A minute later, I arrived at stop 5 and dismissed Joseph and 4 other students. The bus stop was similar to stop 4, with houses that matched in size and design. However, I still had 7 students on board because I'd skipped stops 2 and 4, and I knew what that meant. Rule 13. The true end of this road merges with a larger road at a 3-way stop. If any students are still in the bus once you've passed all 5 stops, go back to the front of the road and try again. Keep doing this until all students have reached their stops, or if you get too tired to continue. I sighed, pulling away from stop 5. You know you're gonna have to do this all over again, right? Tommy asked from behind me. Yeah, I know. At least now you're more prepared. You know about the fake stop between 1 and 2, and you know the mansions between stops 4 and 5. None of that changes when you loop the road, unlike the Rule 3 road or the dead end. Good point, I said, already dreading the second round. All right, here we go again. As we drove back, I spotted what was left of the semi-truck. I pulled over to get a closer look. The truck had smashed head-on into a tree, clearly unable to navigate the curve. The trailer's walls were partially melted, and the roof had collapsed onto burning wooden crates inside. The front of the truck was destroyed. Only the chassis and engine block were still identifiable. Inside the charred remains of the cab, I could see the burnt skeleton of the driver. It sent a shiver down my spine, realizing that could have been me. Holy shit, a student whispered. Tommy and I stepped out to investigate further. The wreck was eerie, the twisted metal and smoldering wood telling a grim story. I examined the remains more closely and saw that the skeleton was curled up in the fetal position in the back of the cab. It seemed the mansion owner's blinding lights had made it impossible for the driver to see the road. Unable to avoid the curve, the truck crashed, and the driver had likely hidden in the back, helpless as the heat from the lights and the flames from the burning fuel tanks melted the truck and incinerated him. Are we looting this too? Tommy asked, half joking. I don't think there's anything worth taking. I just wanted to figure out what happened here. Man, this is insane. I've heard stories about disappearances near the mansion, but I've never seen what actually happens. I guess they updated the rules for a reason. We climbed back into the bus and continued down the road. Eventually, I reached the end and made a left onto Route 3, heading back to the start of Old Military Road to try again. Not long after I got on the highway, a scream pierced through the bus. What the fu... A student's voice was abruptly cut off, followed by the sound of choking. "George, stop the bus now!" Tommy yelled. I slammed the brakes and jumped out of my seat, rushing to the back of the bus. Several students were fighting off a wire that had come to life and was strangling a girl. The wires we'd stolen had started moving on their own, writhing like snakes. We quickly evacuated the bus, and I managed to pull the wire off the choking student. Upon closer inspection, I saw the copper coils twisting and contorting on their own. Inside the bus, the wires slithered around the driver's seat, trying to figure out how to operate the vehicle. Thankfully, I had the keys, so they couldn't start it. For now. "What do we do now?" one of the students asked, clearly terrified. "I could call 911, I offered. "And what are you going to tell them? That we're being attacked by copper snakes?" Tommy replied, sarcasm barely hiding his fear. I paused, then decided to call anyway. I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" A calm voice answered. There are these snake-like things in my bus. We've managed to trap them inside, but they're alive. They're wires," I said, trying to sound as composed as possible. "All right, sir. Can you give me your location?" "I'm on Route 3 near where Old Military Road merges onto the highway." "Got it. We're sending animal control to handle the situation. Can you stay on the line for me?" "Sure," I replied. Just then, I heard the engine roar to life. "How?" I shouted, stunned. "Sir, what's happening?" the operator asked, her tone concerned. "The wires. They've started the bus," I blurted out. The bus lurched forward, crashing into the guardrail, then ricocheted back onto the road. The engine revved as the bus sped down the highway, using the guardrail to guide its path. What?" I stammered. "The snakes just hijacked the bus," Tommy said for me, bewildered. Despite trying to stay professional, I could hear the 911 operator chuckle at the absurdity of the situation. "Okay, sir. We're sending additional units to close the road and stop the runaway bus. Do you need transportation?" "Yes, ma'am. There are 8 of us. We're a school bus group." "That's fine. We'll send 3 units to take you back to safety." "Thank you." A few minutes later, 3 police cars arrived. The officers agreed to take us back to the bus yard, and as we drove down the highway, we caught up with the bus. The wires had somehow figured out how to use the steering wheel, but they clearly had no idea what they were doing. The bus swerved wildly across the road, narrowly avoiding crashes, as multiple police cruisers and even a SWAT truck joined in the pursuit. The chase was on. As we passed the runaway bus, the officer in the car with me started asking questions, trying to get a handle on what had happened. "Sir, how did these snakes get into your bus?" he asked. "I was at a bus stop when they somehow snuck in and tried to choke one of my students, so we had to evacuate the bus." I half lied, trying to sound calm. "And why did you evacuate?" "There were about 50 of them. If we'd stayed, we'd all have probably been strangled to death. I needed to get everyone out so I could focus on freeing the student being attacked." A few minutes later, we arrived at the bus yard. I thanked the officers as they turned around to join the chase. I headed straight for the guard at the shack. "Hey, guard. It's me again." The guard looked up from his phone and stared at me for a moment, as if trying to figure something out. "Oh, hey, George. Where's the bus?" "It got stolen by copper snakes," I said, half joking. "Yeah, of course it did. These jobs are weird as fuck." He shook his head. "Wait, you too?" "Yep," I confirmed, relieved I wasn't the only one experiencing weirdness. "Come on in. I want to show you something," he said, unlocking the thick steel door and inviting us into the shack. Inside, there was a desk against the back wall, an office chair facing it, and 6 monitors mounted above, displaying feeds from cameras around the yard. The desk had a laptop in front of 2 of the monitors, though the others were visible if the laptop was closed. The shack was just big enough to fit all of us, though it was cramped. The guard picked up a sheet of paper from the desk, the same one I saw him look at when I first arrived. He handed it to me. "Rules for Frederickson, bus yard guarding. You must follow these rules when guarding the bus yard. We cannot ensure your safety if you break any of these rules. If someone arrives and identifies as anyone not on this list, hold them at gunpoint until they leave, or you are forced to shoot them to defend yourself. 2. If a bus or other vehicle in the yard starts its engine for no reason, close the metal shades on the window and wait until it turns off. It may attempt to accelerate, but all vehicles should be in park, so this won't work. Do not under any circumstances make your presence known until the engine stops. 3. If one of the monitors shows static, smash it with the crowbar provided. If Rule 2 is happening at the same time, unplug the power strip that powers all the monitors and stay away from the static screen. Mark it with a sticky note. Once Rule 2 ends, smash the monitor before turning the rest back on. 4. At any time, a man may show up thinking your shack is a snack bar. Give him something to eat or you'll be the snack. If Rule 2 is happening, call us for help and hide. 5. If the sun turns red, do not look at the sky for long. It won't kill you, but it will destroy your retinas if you look at it for more than a few seconds. The same goes for the sky, though it takes longer. Cameras are safe to look through, but they can still be damaged. 6. Don't sleep on the job. If you get too tired, call us and we'll send someone to cover for you. Only leave once your replacement has arrived. Do not trust your peripheral vision if you're tired. 7. If you see a shadow figure nearby, pretend it doesn't exist. Do not acknowledge it. 8. At around 3 a.m., your mother may show up and ask about your job. She will look like she does in the present, but if she's deceased, she will appear as she did before she died. If you're adopted, your biological mother will show up. Tell her to leave no matter what she says. This applies even if you're transgender. She will act like a mother, despite being a man. After I read the rules, the students took turns going over them. As we did, my bus finally showed up, though it had taken its sweet time. The bus swerved wildly, hitting objects along the way, still chased by police cruisers and the SWAT truck. We stepped out of the shack just in time to see the bus completely miss the nearby curve and crash head-on into a tree. The wires behind the wheel cranked the steering hard right, and the bus reversed straight into the tree again, then lurched forward, swerving recklessly until it crashed through the yard's fence. It only stopped after colliding with another parked bus. The wires paused, seemingly disoriented, before preparing to continue their wild rampage. But the hood was still open from when the creatures on Old Military Road had tampered with the engine. One of the officers seized the opportunity, pulling out a shotgun and firing repeatedly at the engine block. It was the most American thing I'd ever seen, but it worked. The bus finally stopped moving, engine destroyed. The copper wires, now lifeless, lay tangled across the dashboard. The gunshots worked, slicing through the serpentine belt, causing the bus to lose power steering and several other essential functions. The copper wires, still in control, managed to reverse the bus back onto the road, but with no powered steering, it couldn't maneuver properly. The engine overheated as it continued forward, and just before it could strike the same tree again, it stalled. The bus lurched to a stop, this time with the tree collapsing onto its roof. As the wires fumbled inside, trying to make sense of their predicament, the officers cautiously approached the bus. Seeing it was no longer a threat, the guard, the students, and I followed, keeping a safe distance but getting closer now that the bus couldn't run us over. The officer who had interviewed me earlier saw us approaching. "You call these things snakes?" he asked with disbelief. I shrugged. If I'd said my bus was hijacked by giant copper worms, you wouldn't have believed me. He nodded with a chuckle. "Yeah, fair point." "So, what now?" I asked. "Not sure," the officer replied. "They seem stuck, so maybe we just tow the bus back and leave them inside." Before I could respond, the officer's radio crackled with a message. "Philip, an armored truck just entered the road. It's heading westbound towards your location." "Sarah? I thought you were blocking the road?" "I was, but the truck drove right over my car. It's massive, one of those marauders from Top Gear." Officers nearby gathered around to listen. "I wasn't in the car, though," Sarah continued. "I had just finished explaining why the road was closed when the driver rolled right over it." "Copy that," Philip said, ending the call. Turning to the others, he issued orders. "Use your vehicles and the bus to form a barricade. We can't stop the marauder, but maybe we can slow it down enough to open fire." Not long after, the marauder arrived. It was a beast of a vehicle, jet black, heavily armored, and accompanied by a fleet of police cars in pursuit. A helicopter hovered high above the scene, but the barricade of cars and buses would stand no chance against a truck like that. To everyone's surprise, the Marauder stopped just a few yards from the barricade. It wasn't the cars that made it stop. It had found what it was looking for. The bus. The driver's movements made it clear that the Marauder was there for the copper. Wires. It all made sense. Sarah must have told him why the road was closed, and he'd set off immediately to retrieve them. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew they were outmatched. A news helicopter, mistaken for police backup, hovered lower, but it quickly fled when the passenger in the Marauder opened fire at it. "We're gonna need serious backup," one of the officers muttered into his radio. "Call in the US military. We've got no way to force this guy out." Then, over the truck's loudspeaker, the driver spoke. "This is the Red Moth auction hall. One of our clients reported an item stolen. We are here to retrieve it." An officer with a megaphone responded. "That doesn't justify running over an officer's vehicle and evading the law." "Yes, it does," the voice boomed back. "You wouldn't understand." As this tense standoff unfolded, a blue Ford pickup pulled up next to us, escorted by a police cruiser. The truck drove through the hole the bus had created in the fence and stopped beside us. The police officers escorting the truck ran to assist with the Marauder situation, leaving the driver behind. An older man stepped out of the pickup, moving with surprising ease despite his age. "Rough first day, huh?" he asked me casually. The guard and I stared at him, confused. The students gave us puzzled looks as if to say, "You don't know who this guy is?" After an awkward silence, the man identified himself. "Oh, I'm Ernest Fredrickson, the guy who hired you. Sorry about all this." A million questions raced through my head, but before I could ask any, the Marauder's driver opened his door and pulled out a handful of grenades, ready to throw them at the officers. His mistake, however, was not noticing us standing less than 20 feet away, or perhaps not expecting us to intervene. Without hesitation, I grabbed the guard's arm and ran toward the truck. Ernest pulled out a concealed firearm and followed. The driver saw us at the last second and hastily threw the grenades, trying to slam the door shut. But I wedged my wrist between the door and the truck's frame, preventing him from closing it. He tried repeatedly slamming the door on my wrist, hoping the pain would make me pull back, but I held firm. Meanwhile, the guard and Ernest opened fire on the driver. Half the bullets hit the door, but enough of them found their way into the cab, striking the driver. His grip on the door weakened, and I ripped it open, climbing onto the side of the truck to unbuckle his seatbelt. But before I could pull him out, I spotted another man in the passenger seat, dressed identically to the driver, in what looked like a black military uniform. He had a rifle. Instinctively, I fired before he could raise it, killing him. All of this happened in less than 10 seconds. The grenades the driver had thrown exploded behind the barricade, injuring several officers. Those who weren't hurt tended to their fallen comrades, while the rest rushed over to the Marauder. We stepped back, rejoining the students in the yard. Just as the officers reached the Marauder, the back doors burst open, and 8 more men spilled out. They wore the same black uniforms as the men in the front, though 3 of them carried briefcases instead of weapons. The remaining officers gave chase on foot, but the men with briefcases stopped, turned, and hurled them at the officers. One briefcase hit an officer square in the chest, knocking him to the ground. But that wasn't the worst of it. The briefcases were rigged with explosives. As the officers passed, the briefcases detonated, sending shrapnel in all directions. It wasn't just ordinary debris, either. Shards of the metal briefcases acted like shrapnel, tearing through everything in their path. One shard hit Tommy, another struck the girl who had been strangled by the wire earlier, and Angela was hit as well. 2 pieces tore through me and Ernest. Fortunately, we were all only grazed, but the pain was intense. When the smoke cleared, the devastation was evident. The Marauder itself suffered little damage, but the police cars were in ruins, torn apart by the explosion. Fuel from the wrecked cars spilled across the road, and the intersection's traffic lights hung precariously, bent from the force of the blast. The bus, remarkably, remained intact despite its windows being shattered and body-dented. It had survived, but for how much longer, none of us could say. 7 ambulances arrived from Riverside Street, ready to treat the officers wounded by the grenade explosion. but they found more chaos than expected. Yet, in a dark twist of irony, the number of ambulances was still just enough to transport the surviving officers to the hospital. Out of the 8 men from the back of the Marauder, 5 survived with minor injuries, while the other 3 were either dead or gravely injured. The students took shelter in the guard shack as the guard, Ernest, and I approached the survivors, guns drawn. Seeing us, the uninjured men panicked. They dropped their injured comrades and fled down Route 3, heading in the same direction the Marauder had come from. We gave chase, and in a brief pursuit managed to shoot all 5 of them. When we returned to the bus yard, we noticed a man talking with one of the paramedics. "What do you mean?" "The snack bar is right there." "What do you mean it's not open?" I instantly realized what was happening. Rule 4. At any time, a man may show up thinking your shack is a snack bar. Give him something to eat, or you'll be the snack. The paramedics had no idea. "Sir, we're paramedics. We don't have a snack bar," one of them said, looking bewildered. The man's expression changed from annoyed to furious. His voice grew deep and monstrous as he growled, "Give me a snack, right now." Before anyone could react, his fingernails elongated into claws, and in one swift motion, he slashed at the paramedic, peeling off a large chunk of flesh from his forearm. The paramedic screamed in agony, running off, literally skinned alive. After his grisly attack, the man's fingernails broke off, and he returned to his normal state. He smiled as if nothing had happened and said, "Thank you. Have a nice day," before walking off into the distance, followed by several shadowy figures that appeared near him. Rule 7. If you see a shadow figure roaming the nearby area, pretend it doesn't exist. Do not let it know it has physically entered our world. I hurried to the paramedics, explaining the rules. Thankfully, they complied, all too aware of what happens when someone breaks a rule after witnessing the horrific scene. As the paramedics continued loading the injured officers into the ambulances, a heavy-duty tow truck suddenly came barreling down Riverside Street at breakneck speed. It smashed through 2 ambulances as it made a sharp right turn onto Route 3, nearly flipping over in the process. The tow truck sped straight for the bus, and within moments, 2 men, identical to the ones in the Marauder, jumped out and hooked it up to the tow cable. In less than 15 seconds, they were back in the truck and gone, disappearing down the road with the bus. The paramedics were understandably shaken and ready to leave, but the men in the tow truck hadn't stuck around long enough to attack anyone. Remarkably, both ambulances that were hit were still drivable. One paramedic, who had been run over by his own ambulance in the crash, was injured, but expected to make a full recovery after being transported by his co-workers. Out of the 17 officers present, only 7 survived. 5 officers had been killed instantly by the briefcase bombs while pursuing the Marauder's men. 3 more officers, who had been inside the Marauder when the explosions occurred, survived without injury. 7 officers were injured by the grenades, and 4 were pronounced dead at the scene. 2 others died en route to the hospital, and 1 survived with severe injuries but is expected to recover. Among the 4 officers tending to the injured, 1 died at the scene, another was critically injured but is expected to recover, and the remaining 2 escaped with only minor wounds. Of the 6 officers unaccounted for during the explosion, all were found dead at the scene. When it came time to give my official statement, I stuck to the story. I told them that I had said snakes because the truth would have been too unbelievable. I described how a pile of copper wires at a bus stop had somehow entered the bus and caused havoc. The students backed me up, along with Ernest, the guard, and the surviving officers. None of us were charged, and the 3 of us who had taken out the Marauder were praised for our bravery. All 10 of the men from the Marauder died at the scene, but their bodies were unidentifiable. The Marauder itself was impounded by the police. When they ran the license plate, it was traced back to a man named Alfred Cornell, whose address was listed as a property in Maine. However, when the police investigated, they found nothing but an empty lot, with a single brick wall standing there, a bizarre structure, 20 feet long, 8 feet tall, and 1 foot thick, with no sign of any residence. The tow truck and the bus disappeared, leaving no trace. Despite Ernest's attempts to track down the bus using its onboard GPS, the signal had been disabled. No one has seen either vehicle since. As for the news helicopter, it turned out to be part of a local station attempting to film the chaos. The footage they managed to capture was ordered to be deleted by the federal government, and the station was instructed not to speak of the incident until further notice. Those of us who witnessed the event were essentially given non-disclosure agreements by the government. The families of the fallen officers received substantial settlements, while the surviving officers had their medical bills covered and were also compensated. The 7 students who didn't make it to their stops were temporarily taken in by Ernest, his wife, and his 3 grown children until they could be returned to their families. Before I left, Ernest revealed something interesting. I hadn't been making $20 an hour after all. The ad was posted that way to avoid attracting unwanted attention. In reality, I had been earning $200 an hour, and Ernest gave me a $1,000 bonus for everything I'd gone through that day. The guard's pay was similarly increased tenfold, and he too received a bonus. Finally, I told Ernest the full story about what had really happened with the mansion. After hearing it, he added a new rule for all future bus drivers. Rule 14: do not steal from the mansion owners. They will find you, and they will do whatever it takes to get their belongings back.